Hi there, this is Jody back with chapter 2 from our book, From Bondage to Bonding by Nancy Groom, and Escaping Codependency, Embracing Biblical Love. So here we go with chapter 2. So chapter 2, self-forfeiture, resigned to helplessness. In order to be intimate, we need a self. Otherwise, getting close to another person always offers the possibility of being swallowed up by that person. Anne Wilson Shea, Codependence Misunderstood, Mistreated. Sitting disconsolate on the edge of her bed, trying to make sense of her life, Jenny thought back to how she had loved Brad. Idolized him, really. He had been everything she'd always dreamed of in a man. Physically strong, sure of himself, fun to be with, a man going places. He had asked her to go with him, to walk his road and bear his children. Of course, she said yes. She seemed to have found her very self in finding Brad. That, in fact, was part of the problem. Jenny had become so enmeshed with Brad that she no longer knew who Jenny was. She sometimes wondered if she existed at all. Only Brad seemed real. His successes were her successes. His failures, hers too. She took his emotional temperature each morning to determine what her own day would look like. A look or comment from him could always make or break her mood. The same was true of Jenny's relationship with the children. When they were happy, she was happy. Their problems felt like her problems. Last month, Jody took her scholastic aptitude test, and it was Jenny who felt nervous and uptight. She had lived her life for, and perhaps through, her daughters, anticipating their needs and meeting them in spite of any inconvenience. She had cooked for, done homework with, comforted, cleaned up after, instructed, shopped for, attended athletic events of, and chauffeured them for over 18 years. In fact, she couldn't remember what it was like to do something just for herself. If asked, she would have said doing things for herself felt selfish. Jenny wasn't the person she'd been when she married Brad. In fact, she wasn't sure what sort of person she was at all. She was beginning to realize that who she was depended on too much on whom she was with at any given moment. Chameleon-like, she had become an expert at being and doing whatever was expected, unable to determine for sure what she was like or what she liked. Jenny had the keen sense she was running out of options. She felt trapped, without choice, compelled to live as she had always lived with Brad. Her absence of choice evidenced itself particularly in two areas: feeling controlled, especially by Brad, and forfeiting her true self. Let's examine both areas in greater detail because they characterize the experience of most codependents. Control by others. The first aspect of feeling powerless in relationships is the sense of having one's life controlled by someone else. Usually, a codependent can point to someone, a relative or close friend, whose behavior, attitudes, or opinions make them do things they don't really want to do. Codependents say things like, "I always have to organize my schedule around my children's plans," or "My husband made me lie to the boss because he had a hangover again," or "I have to bake a casserole for my sick friend." As I look back over my own history of codependency and consider the times I felt most choiceless, one incident in particular comes to mind. At that time, Bill and I had been married less than 5 years, and we were living with our 3-year-old son, Christopher, in the Florida Keys. Bill was a park ranger at Bahia Honda State Park, and our home was a trailer in a small complex that housed the ranger families across from the main park. It was not uncommon for the rangers and their families to party together in our communal backyard on the weekends. The partying inevitably included considerable drinking, which made me particularly uncomfortable because I'd grown up in an alcoholic home and was repulsed by any kind of drunkenness. On this particular Saturday night, the party ran longer than usual, and Bill's drinking had made him uncharacteristically belligerent. Appalled when his intended fistfight with another ranger at our doorstep had to be halted by the propitious intervention of friends, I heaved a huge sigh of relief soon afterward when he fell into bed, oblivious to everything, including my inner terror and chaos. Until then, I'd pushed my anxiety about Bill's drinking to the back of my mind, but that night was different. My horror of conflict and fear that I'd married an alcoholic forced itself into my unwilling awareness, and I was terrified. Feeling utterly out of control, I walked out into the moonlight past our now quiet neighborhood and came to a large flat rock where I sat and cried out in helplessness to God. What am I going to do? What will become of Christopher and me now? God, why did you allow me to get into a mess like this? My helplessness that night ought to have thrust me not only into dependence on God, but also into a willingness to face the underlying dynamics of my own codependency and to change my destructive pattern of protecting Bill from the consequences of his drinking. Unfortunately, that did not happen until things were much worse for Bill and me. But I remember how victimized I felt back then and how compulsively I went back to the next day, both into denial and into trying to control Bill's drinking. Because getting well wasn't an option for me then. I had to keep running from reality, which kept me feeling crazy and out of control for years. Compulsive behaviors make the person who engages in them feel helpless to do things differently, robbed of options by the real or imagined reactions of others. Codependents like Jenny and me live at the mercy of others' demands or expectations, and we end up feeling used and powerless. We look to others for permission to do something or to be someone, and the loss of empowerment results in a profound anger or depression we can neither change nor understand. Without choice, codependents feel driven, helpless, and victimized. Victimization. The particulars of victimization may vary from individual to individual, but the pattern is remarkably similar. Someone indicates a need by a word, a glance, or a mood, and the codependent immediately knows that what must be done. Meet that need, no matter what the personal cost in terms of time, energy, even principle. In the mind of the codependent, the other person's request or insinuation always takes precedence over his or her own plans, feelings, or personal agenda. Time and time again, the decision is made. Do what the other person wants done. And time again, the resentment builds. Why do I always get stuck with the dirty end of every day or dirty end of every deal? The victim mentality is thus reinforced and the sense of powerlessness increases. It is a vicious cycle, and just telling the codependent to stop doing it is not enough. The victimization, like the codependency itself, has taken on a life of its own. Being a victim is a compulsion the codependent is unable to just stop. It will take an entirely new way of looking at oneself, of looking at and living life for a person like Jenny to change her victimized pattern of dealing with her family. It will take the very power of God. In a later chapter, we will examine in more detail what is needed for changing an established pattern of self-victimization. King without a self. King Ahab, whose story is found in 1 Kings 21, is an example of a man who felt powerless to manage his life. Naboth, one of Ahab's subjects, owned a vineyard adjacent to the palace that Ahab wanted, even though he knew God had forbidden such a sale of one's real estate inheritance. When Naboth refused to sell his vineyard to the king, Ahab went home sullen and angry. He lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. Ahab was thwarted. He couldn't get what he felt he needed to make him happy. So he played the role of martyr, hoping someone would take up his cause. His wife Jezebel was glad to comply. "Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you that vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite," she told him. Ahab knew Jezebel would have to resort to treachery to accomplish his goal, yet he yielded his power to her. He lacked the inner substance either to stand up to her by forbidding her interference or to do himself what he knew was right, by accepting with grace Naboth's godly decision. Ahab's personal abdication, however, didn't negate his accountability before God. Jezebel's successful conspiracy to have Naboth murdered was considered to be Ahab's sin in God's eyes. Both its punishment and its later postponement because of Ahab's repentance were the result of Ahab's responsibility for his chosen abdication to his wife's control. The chronicler added this comment: "There was never a man like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife." Ahab's self-forfeiture was ultimately his own choice, and it had dire consequences for himself, his family, and Israel. External referenting. Feeling powerless in relationships isn't just about feeling controlled by others. It's also about feeling like a non-person. Many codependents sense they exist only as an extension of someone else. They don't know their own thoughts, opinions, or preferences because over the years they've become too involved in sensing and reacting to other people's thoughts, opinions, and preferences. One of the earliest clues I had that I was codependent was when someone asked me what my favorite color was, and I realized I had no idea. I felt like the friend of mine who once turned to her companion in the clothing store and asked, "Do I like this shirt?" Psychologists call this tendency to adopt the opinions or moods of others external referenting. External referenting means a person takes his or her cues about what to think and believe, or how to talk and behave from other people. Codependents use someone or something outside themselves as a reference point for who they should be or what they should do. Jenny, for example, would be having a good day until Brad came home in a terrible mood, and then she ended up having a bad day too. A recovering codependent I know said it was hard work to retain his own healthy emotional outlook when he was with his family, instead of giving in to their negative and destructive way of seeing life. Finding and being oneself are not easy. Blurring of boundaries. Another common codependent phenomenon closely related to external referenting is the blurring of boundaries. People with blurred boundaries don't know where they end and where the other person begins in a relationship. They are enmeshed, unable to separate the feelings or experiences of one from the other. There was a time when I wasn't sure whether it was I or my husband who had experienced physical abuse in childhood. Bill's history had become fused with my own. Someone once said, "You know you're codependent when you're drowning and someone else's life flashes before your eyes." I was getting a kick out of that. Codependents with blurred boundaries often allow someone else to hurt or abuse them because they somehow think that person has a right to invade their privacy, plans, or personal well-being with impunity. Sexually abused children, for example, believe they have no boundaries, that the doorknob is always on the outside of their door, and they are on the inside with no right to set limits. Who they really are becomes lost in the avalanche of other people's intentions and definitions of who they are. Jenny said nothing if Brad verbally abused her with critical and destructive words when he was drinking, nor did she intervene for her children when Brad did the same thing to them. Because she wasn't sure of who she was or what her limits ought to be, she thought Brad had the right to mistreat her. He might, or as he might mistreat himself. In fact, some messages she heard in church regarding submission reinforced her belief that she didn't have any rights to claim herself in relationship to Brad. Jenny's perceived absence of choice with regard to Brad was related to her absence of boundaries with regard to herself. Codependents deeply enmeshed in another person often fail to take basic care of themselves. They don't pay attention to their own needs or feelings because they don't think their needs or feelings have any validity. Though Jenny was angry with Brad, she didn't really believe her anger was legitimate. Accustomed to living in Brad's skin and seeing things from his point of view, she couldn't admit his drinking was alcoholic because he didn't see it as alcoholic. Unable to own her own fear, anger, and despair, Jenny felt she was going crazy. She'd lost herself and had no idea how to find what she had lost. Was Jesus controlled by others? One of the confusing things about codependency is that codependent behaviors often masquerade as Christian virtues. Jesus instructed us to love others as ourselves, to offer the other cheek to those who strike us. The Apostle Paul said we are to consider others better than ourselves and to bear one another's burdens. Losing oneself and sacrificing for others seem to be the biblical epitome of piety. Is codependency the scriptural norm? Should believers seek to become glad victims of other people's mistreatment? Let's look at Jesus. Was he codependent? Did he let himself be controlled by others, a victim without choices? Jesus' life reveals that he never let people control his decisions, neither by their mood, expectations, or behavior. Far from being a victim, he willingly chose to serve others. but not because he had to. When he washed the disciples' feet on the day before his death, the Apostle John revealed the internal context of Jesus' decision. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. John 13, 3 and 5. Or 3 to 5. Jesus didn't feel pressured to wash the dirty feet of his tired and hungry disciples so they would like him. He didn't feel they were controlling him and he had no other choice. Rather, Jesus was aware of his position, freely choosing his task because he knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Far from being a victim, Jesus even consented to the place, time, and manner of his own death. He said, "The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, that I lay it down at my own accord." John 10, 17 to 18. He surely was troubled in Gethsemane as he faced his coming crucifixion, but his words were not the words of a helpless victim. He chose to die. Was Jesus a non-person? Did Jesus forfeit himself or sacrifice his personhood when he chose servanthood? Was he externally referented, taking his identity from what others thought or expected of him? Were his boundaries blurred so that he allowed his detractors to oppose his ministry without interference? In contrast to the frail identities many codependents have, Jesus always knew clearly who he was and what his purposes were. He knew his identity he knew he had come from heaven to do the will of his Father. And his identity never gave way to the expectation of others. He didn't let the crowd crown him, though he realized he deserved and would one day receive their homage. He acknowledged as true his good friend Peter's declaration that he was Messiah, that he soon afterward rebuked him for insisting he did not die as the messianic sacrifice. Jesus never allowed himself to be squeezed into anyone's mold, no matter how friendly or antagonistic the push. When the Pharisees opposed his ministry, he minced no words, publicly rebuking them for their disbelief, even though they represented the most respected party of the religious establishment of his day. Though Jesus gave unstintingly of himself in genuine love during his entire life, it cannot be said that he ever lost or gave up his sense of self. Summing up, the marriage of Jenny and Brad is one example of the kind of relationship in which millions of people find themselves trapped. Codependents feel controlled by others and have lost a sense of their own personhood. Unsure of who they are, feeling powerless to manage their lives, codependents, even Christians trapped in codependency, cannot live authentically. Their behaviors might mimic the way Jesus lived, but in their inner spirits, they are far from being the free, loving, glad servants Jesus modeled to his disciples. In fact, they see themselves as not only powerless, but essentially worthless. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at an altogether different type of codependent and consider how codependents view themselves. So, questions for building community. So these are the questions. They're good to write down and then answer. Re-watch the video if you don't have the book to read, and then answer these questions. They really do open up a lot of insight and they help you in the process. Question 1. From the case study of Jenny and Brad, give specific examples of how Jenny felt. A, powerless, controlled by others. And B, enmeshed, overly identified with other people and their feelings. Question 2. What is the difference between enmeshment and empathy? That's a good one. In your own words, 3, I keep forgetting the number. 3, in your own words, tell what is meant by the codependent characteristic of self-forfeiture. 4, do you see any evidence of self-forfeiture in yourself or someone you love? Explain. 5, Name a specific circumstance, one not mentioned in this chapter, in which Jesus might have appeared to be a victim, then explain why he was not a victim in that circumstance. 6. Codependents often evidence Christian behaviors like sacrificing their own preferences or convenience for the sake of others. Give an example of how a seemingly unselfish behavior might actually be a codependent behavior. That's a good question to work on. And 7. Why would our spiritual enemy, Satan, not want Christians to acknowledge their addictions or codependency? So this was chapter 2 in our codependency book, and there's a lot of stuff in there. It's a great introduction. It's one of my favorite chapters, and the questions are really great too. So I definitely encourage you to write down the questions and take some time to answer, and we will carry over to chapter 3 in a little while. So thanks everybody. We're just going to pray real quick. I don't think I prayed at the beginning, but we will pray right now. Lord, we just ask you to have your way with all those that are watching, God, that are reading this book through the video, Lord. We ask that you do a work in their life, God. Help them to open up their eyes. Give them strength and courage, God, to face the things that they're scared to face. And let's be unafraid of what you have to offer in the long run, God. And we know that there are blessings at the end, God. Although it's scary right now, our comfort zones are dangerous. And with your power and with your protection, God, we'll safely move out of those and into your will and into your grace, God. So we just ask you to have your way right now, Lord. Bless those that are watching. And I just pray that we all, learn something from this book, apply it to our lives, share the process with others. And don't be afraid, because change is good. We're going from bondage to bonding, right? All right. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great evening, and I will see you on chapter 3. Bye.